Avoidants don't fear love itself. They fear the loss of control that comes with real attachment. Love, when it stays light or undefined, feels manageable. It can be compartmentalized. It can be easy without rearranging the internal structure that keeps them feeling safe. But when love begins to root, when it moves from interest into emotional relevance, it threatens the system they've relied on to survive closeness. Falling for you violated an internal rule that governs how they move through relationships. I stay safe by staying self-contained. This rule isn't conscious or malicious. It was learned early, reinforced repeatedly, and rewarded over time. Independence became the solution to emotional uncertainty. Self-reliance became protection. Not needing became strength. Your presence didn't feel chaotic or demanding. There was no emotional volatility to push against. No drama to justify distance. Instead, you felt disarming. You were steady, open, emotionally accessible without being intrusive. That kind of presence lowers defenses because it doesn't give the avoidant anything to resist. And that's exactly what made it dangerous. When defenses drop without a fight, feelings rush in unfiltered, there's no buffer. No gradual acclimation, the nervous system registers closeness before the mind can make sense of it. Suddenly, they care, and caring wasn't part of the plan. Caring introduces unpredictability, it introduces vulnerability, it introduces the possibility of being changed by someone else. For an avoidant, being changed feels like losing oneself. So the pullback begins not as a rejection, but as a reflex, a way to restore internal order. Distance becomes the fastest path back to equilibrium. They don't leave because the connection is wrong. They leave because it's working in ways they don't know how to contain. The closer they felt, the more distance they needed to breathe. For an avoidant, attraction doesn't activate bonding first. It activates threat assessment. While others lean in when they feel drawn, avoidants pause, they scan, they measure. The nervous system asks, not do I want this, but can I afford this? As attraction deepened, questions surfaced quietly beneath the surface, not as conscious doubts about you, but as internal calculations about cost. How much will this demand of me? What will I lose if this deepens? How much of myself will I have to give up to stay? These questions aren't pessimistic, they're protective. Avoidance learned early that closeness often comes with expectation. Expectation leads to obligation. Obligation threatens autonomy. So when attraction starts to feel like attachment, the body reacts before the mind can rationalize it. Distance wasn't rejection. It was regulation. Stepping back allowed their nervous system to slow down. It reduced the emotional intensity to a level that felt familiar. In distance, they could breathe again. They could think, they could feel like themselves. And that relief reinforces the behavior. The body learns. When I step away, I feel safer. This is why the shift often feels abrupt to you. One moment, there's warmth, engagement, emotional presence. The next, there's space, silence, or emotional flattening. What changed wasn't their interest. What changed was their capacity to stay regulated while feeling it. The closer they felt, the more they needed distance to breathe. Not because closeness was suffocating, but because it was destabilizing. It challenged the belief that they could remain untouched in intimacy. In their system, distance isn't the absence of feeling, it's the mechanism that makes feeling tolerable. And until they learn that closeness doesn't require self-abandonment, distance will always feel like the safer choice, even when it costs them the connection they secretly didn't want to lose. They don't just avoid you, they avoid the version of themselves that wanted you. Wanting you cracked the image they depend on to feel safe in the world. The independent one, the unbothered one, the one who doesn't need, doesn't cling, doesn't get affected. This identity wasn't chosen out of arrogance, it was built out of survival. At some point, needing someone came with disappointment, intrusion, or emotional overwhelm. So they learned to equate self-sufficiency with dignity. When they felt drawn to you, that identity fractured, not dramatically, quietly, subtly, in moments where they noticed themselves thinking about you when you weren't there, in the ease they felt opening up, in the comfort of being emotionally held without being controlled. Those moments created a dangerous realization: I want this, and wanting contradicts the story they've lived inside for years. So they didn't just step back from you, they stepped back from their own vulnerability, Because vulnerability to an avoidant isn't neutral. It's associated with shame, not the loud, self punishing kind, but the quiet kind that whispers, "You're weaker than you thought." And when shame appears, avoidants don't confess it, they contain it. Shame doesn't look like guilt in avoidance, it looks like silence, a delay in responses, a cooling of tone, a sudden need for space that can't be explained without exposure. Silence is protective. It restores the image of control. It lets them retreat into the version of themselves that feels familiar and respectable. Inside that silence, a loop forms. They miss you, then judge themselves for missing you. They feel drawn, then criticize themselves for feeling drawn. Each feeling becomes evidence that they're losing composure. And instead of sharing that internal conflict, they pull away to stop the feedback loop altogether. Distance becomes the antidote to shame. This is why their withdrawal often feels disproportionate to what happened. There was no argument, no demand, no pressure, just connection. And connection triggered a self-confrontation they weren't prepared for. Avoidants don't fear intimacy because it's intense. They fear it because it reveals parts of themselves they've worked hard to keep dormant. Consistency would have meant admitting this was real. Consistency isn't just about showing up. It's about admitting significance. To be consistent with you would have meant acknowledging that this connection mattered, not just to you, but to them. And that admission carries weight. Emotional ownership means recognizing that your presence has impact and that their absence would be felt. Ownership creates expectation. Expectation creates responsibility. Responsibility threatens autonomy in the avoidant nervous system. Not because autonomy is selfish, but because autonomy once meant safety. It meant no one could demand more than they had to give. It meant they could leave before being needed. So instead of settling into a steady rhythm, they oscillated, warm, then distant, open, then closed, present, then gone. These shifts weren't designed to confuse you. They were attempts to manage internal conflict. One part of them wanted closeness. Another part wanted containment. Consistency would have required choosing one. Oscillation. Let them have both temporarily. When they were warm, they were responding to genuine connection. When they pulled back, they were responding to fear. Not fear of you, fear of what staying would require emotionally. Each retreat restored a sense of independence. Each return reactivated longing. And without the tools to integrate those states, they moved back and forth between them. This split is exhausting for both people. For you, it felt destabilizing. For them, it felt necessary. Consistency would have forced them to face questions they weren't ready to answer. What do I owe this connection? What does staying say about me? What happens if I can't maintain the image of being unaffected? Avoidants often believe that if they stay, they'll eventually fail, disappoint, withdraw, or hurt the other person. So they preemptively destabilize the bond. Inconsistency becomes a way to avoid being fully responsible for the emotional outcome. If nothing is fully established, nothing can be fully lost. But here's the quiet truth: the inconsistency wasn't because the connection was weak. It was because it was too real, real enough to demand presence, real enough to challenge old survival strategies, real enough to require a new way of being that they hadn't yet learned. They weren't unsure about you. They were unsure about who they'd have to become to stay. And until an avoidant learns that autonomy and attachment don't have to cancel each other out, consistency will always feel like a risk. Not because love is unsafe, but because it asks them to live without the armor that once protected them. They felt safest with you until safety became intimacy. You didn't overwhelm them. You didn't push for more than they offered. You didn't demand constant reassurance or emotional performance. In fact, what you gave them was exactly what they claimed to want: calm, presence, emotional availability without pressure. You met them where they were, without collapsing into them or chasing their distance. And that's precisely what bypassed their defenses. Avoidants are highly attuned to pressure. They can sense expectation long before it's spoken. They know how to brace against demands, conflict, and emotional chaos. But what they're not prepared for is safety that doesn't ask for anything in return. Safety disarms. It lowers vigilance. It invites the nervous system to rest. With you, they didn't have to perform independence. They didn't have to manage your emotions. They didn't have to prove anything. Your steadiness allowed them to exhale, and in that exhale, closeness happened naturally. Not because you forced it, but because there was no reason to resist. Safety turned into intimacy. Intimacy isn't just closeness, it's mutual emotional access. It's being known without hiding. And when that line was crossed, even subtly, the alarm went off. Not because intimacy was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. The avoidant nervous system associates closeness with eventual cost. So when intimacy appeared without struggle, it felt suspicious. That's when retreat happened. Not abruptly, but progressively. Responses slowed. Energy shifted, emotional availability thinned. To you, it felt like being dropped, like the ground disappeared under your feet, without warning. To them, it felt like restoring balance. They needed to create space before the connection rewired them further. This is one of the most painful dynamics to experience because nothing went wrong. There was no conflict to point to, no mistake to fix. You didn't cross a line. You simply existed in a way that allowed them to feel deeply, and that depth exceeded their capacity to stay present. Avoidants don't detach emotionally, they detach physically. When avoidants pull away, it often looks like emotional detachment, but internally, that's not what's happening. They detach physically, reducing contact, creating space, limiting interaction, while the emotional process continues quietly underneath. Distance becomes the container in which they can feel without being seen. Distance allows them to idealize without engaging. When you're not there, there's no pressure to show up consistently, no need to navigate real-time emotions. In absence, they can remember the good, soften the edges, replay moments without the vulnerability of presence. You become safe again because you're not asking anything. They miss you without risking. Missing you doesn't require response. It doesn't require explanation or follow through. It's a private experience that belongs only to them. In distance, longing feels manageable. In closeness, longing feels demanding. They feel without responding. Emotion stays internal, unexpressed, unshared. This allows them to preserve the image of control while still being emotionally affected. To others, it looks like they've moved on. Inside, the bond remains unresolved. Avoidants don't process feelings through action, they process them through absence. Time and space allow emotions to surface in slow, fragmented ways. That's why you may have sensed their presence more strongly after they pulled away. The connection didn't disappear, it became internalized. In absence, you weren't triggering their defenses. There was no immediacy, no need to regulate closeness. That's when the feeling could expand. Ironically, distance gave them the freedom to feel what closeness required them to suppress. This creates a confusing experience for you. You might have felt a lingering emotional pull, a sense that they were still there energetically, even while being unavailable behaviorally. That wasn't imagined. They were processing, just not in a way that invited reconnection. The fantasy they carry in distance isn't about control over you, it's about control over themselves. Distance lets them keep the connection intact without risking the identity they rely on. It's a compromise between attachment and autonomy, one that feels safer than choosing either fully. But this fantasy has limits because feelings processed in absence don't integrate. They linger. They resurface unexpectedly. They show up as regret, nostalgia, or sudden reach-outs long after you've detached. Not because they didn't value you, but because they never learned how to stay present when it mattered. And that's the quiet tragedy of avoidant love. They feel most deeply where they feel least capable of staying. Chasing would have required admitting they were attached. Chasing isn't just a behavior. In the avoidant nervous system, it's a confession. It says, this matters to me. It says, I'm affected. It says, I need something outside of myself. And that admission feels like failure to someone who learned early that safety comes from self-reliance. For avoidance, pursuit equals dependence. And dependence doesn't register as romance. It registers as danger. Not because they look down on need, but because need once came with cost. It meant disappointment, loss of dignity, or emotional chaos. So they learn to associate wanting with weakness and weakness with loss of control. So instead of chasing you, they chose withdrawal, not dramatically, not cruelly, but quietly. They reduced contact, they created space, they let time stretch. Withdrawal gave them back the internal posture they trusted, composed, self contained, untouched. They chose rationalization. They told themselves stories that made distance feel reasonable. This isn't the right time. I'm too busy. We want different things. The connection isn't that deep. These narratives weren't lies meant to deceive you. They were psychological scaffolding meant to stabilize themselves. Rationalization allowed them to step away without confronting the truth of their attachment. They chose self justification. Every avoided message, every missed opportunity to reach out was internally explained. I'm protecting my peace. I don't want to lead them on. I'm just being realistic. These justifications weren't cold, they were protective. They allowed them to maintain an identity that didn't include longing, not because they didn't care, but because caring threatened who they believed themselves to be. To chase you would have meant acknowledging that the connection had power over them. It would have meant risking exposure. And exposure for avoidance feels like standing without armor. So they stayed still. And in staying still, they appeared indifferent. But indifference is often the performance of someone trying not to reveal how deeply they've been moved. You weren't a person to them, you were a disruption. You weren't just someone they liked. You were a mirror that reflected a version of themselves they weren't prepared to meet with you. Emotional safety existed without pressure. You didn't demand constant access. You didn't try to control the pace. You allowed connection to unfold naturally. That alone was disruptive. You offered connection without control, no games, no manipulation, no emotional debt, just presence. And presence, when it's clean and consistent, exposes the absence of defenses. It invites authenticity. It asks nothing, and that's what makes it destabilizing. You offered intimacy without demand. You didn't require them to perform closeness or prove their feelings. You allowed them to come forward as they were, and in doing so, you showed them something unfamiliar. Intimacy doesn't have to cost autonomy. That mirror was unfamiliar. And unfamiliar doesn't feel neutral to an avoidant. It feels unsafe, not because it's bad, but because it challenges the blueprint they've lived by. If intimacy can exist without control, then the walls they built may no longer be necessary. And if the walls aren't necessary, then what were they protecting themselves from all this time? Avoidants don't run from people. They run from unfamiliar versions of themselves, from the self that wants, from the self that softens, from the self that could stay. You didn't threaten them with loss. You threatened them with change. You represented a way of relating that didn't require emotional armor. And armor, once worn long enough, becomes identity. Removing it feels like losing oneself, even if what's underneath is more real. That's why their distance can feel so personal. It isn't about your worth. It's about their readiness to inhabit a self they haven't yet learned to trust. You didn't destabilize them by doing too much. You destabilize them by being real. And until an avoidant learns that attachment doesn't erase autonomy, that closeness doesn't equal captivity, they will continue to retreat from the very connections that reveal who they could become. They felt you most when you stopped trying to be felt. When you stopped reaching, something fundamental shifted in the emotional field between you. Not because you played a tactic, not because you withdrew to provoke a response, but because the pressure disappeared, and with it, the avoidance primary defense. When you stopped reaching, there was no pressure to perform, no subtle expectation to respond a certain way, no emotional tone they had to manage. Your silence didn't accuse them. It didn't chase them. It simply existed. And for the first time, the connection wasn't demanding regulation. When you stopped reaching, there was no need for them to withdraw. Avoidants pull away most intensely when they feel pursued, not because pursuit is wrong, but because it activates the fear of engulfment. Your detachment removed the stimulus that triggered their distancing reflex. They didn't have to protect their autonomy anymore. It wasn't under threat. When you stopped reaching, no one was chasing their distance. And this is where the paradox appears. Avoidants rely on distance to regulate closeness, but distance only works when someone is still oriented toward them. When the other person truly steps back, distance loses its function. It no longer feels like control, it feels like absence. That's when the loss registered. Not loudly, not dramatically, internally. There was no panic, no immediate pursuit, no emotional confession. Avoidants don't process loss through outward collapse. They process it through quiet realization, through moments where the emotional tether they assumed would always be there isn't. Your detachment forced them to confront something they had avoided up until that point. The connection wasn't just emotionally available, it was conditional on presence. And once presence was removed without protest, the illusion of endless access dissolved. This is why your absence felt heavier than your presence ever could. When you were there, they could regulate closeness by pulling back. When you weren't, there was nothing to regulate against. The emotional space you once occupied didn't close, it echoed. Avoidants often mistake availability for permanence. They assume emotional access is infinite because it always has been. When that access ends quietly, without drama, without explanation, the nervous system finally feels the cost of distance. They didn't miss you because you disappeared. They missed you because you stopped holding the connection open. And that distinction matters. Because what landed wasn't abandonment, it was consequence. They didn't stay away because you weren't enough. They stayed away because you mattered. You weren't rejected. You were unintegrated. You entered their emotional system faster than they knew how to metabolize. You represented closeness without chaos, intimacy without control, connection without debt. And while that sounds ideal, it destabilized the very strategies they rely on to feel safe. They didn't lose interest. They lost emotional control. And for avoidance, emotional control is everything. It's how they survive intimacy without dissolving into it. When they felt themselves caring in ways that they couldn't manage, distance became the only solution they trusted. This is the part most people misunderstand. Avoidants don't leave because something is missing. They leave because something is too present, too alive, too exposing, too capable of changing them. They stayed away, not because you asked for too much, but because you didn't. You didn't demand. You didn't chase. You didn't collapse into their inconsistency. And that forced them to confront the reality of their own emotional limits. You weren't forgotten. You were compartmentalized, stored in a place they don't know how to access without risk. And that's why avoidant loss doesn't look like heartbreak. It looks like restraint. Avoidants don't grieve loudly. They grieve in fragments, in delayed realizations, in moments where they notice how few people feel like you did, in comparisons they never voice, in the quiet understanding that what they stepped away from wasn't overwhelming, it was rare. But here's the most important truth. Avoidants don't stay where they feel deeply until they learn how to stay with themselves, until they can tolerate vulnerability without shame, until they can experience attachment without equating it to loss of autonomy, until they can let closeness exist without retreating to control. Your role was never to teach them that. Your role was never to wait for them to grow. Your role was simply to be who you were, and that was enough to leave an imprint they couldn't outrun. Not because you chased, not because you proved your worth, but because when you finally stepped back, the absence revealed what presence had quietly built. You didn't disappear. You became undeniable.